Hello, I'm Heather, and this is Recently Seen Reading, and I thought I would do a hopefully short and compressed July 2023 wrap-up. It's been an odd reading month for me. I've been more than normal levels of distraction. I think I mentioned that in my last video. I've been finding it difficult to focus on reading. We had 3 months of rain in one day in July, which caused flash flooding, which is not the norm here, and some deaths. I have no immediate connection to the people who died, but the whole massive amount of rapid flooding I found quite distracting. And then the other thing that I found distracting is I sprained my ankle really badly in late June, and I'm about halfway through our rehab program, and I've found that instead of turning all of this idle time where I'm stuck being off my feet into reading, I've not been able to do that. It's a very strange psychological process for me to notice how much what is really garden variety type of pain and discomfort distracts me from reading, which I've been doing as my primary mode of entertainment and intellectual engagement since I was 5 years old. So a very weird reading month. I'm not going to go through all of the books I read this month, but there are three. So three I'd like to talk to you a little bit about. The first one I want to talk to you about is by Norma. So Kinauvit, What's Your Name? The Eskimo Disc System and a Daughter's Search for Her Grandmother. So this came out this year or last year probably 2022, and Dunning won the 2018 Governor General's Award for a collection of short stories, which I thought some of them were pretty good. There are a couple that have stuck with me, so I thought it would be interesting to read this book. It's a thorough, easy to digest, an easy to understand account of the Eskimo disc system, which was imposed upon the Inuit in the north about 1940, 1950, and was discontinued in the 70s. So essentially these were discs, sometimes put on strings or leather cords that identified each Inuk by a number. And in order to get government services, so everything from education, food, interactions with any kind of legal system, you had to present your disc and disc number. It was an unpleasant experience for the Inuit, and Dunning is very careful to talk about how to put this, to talk about the entire experience. And what becomes clear as she's going through what the disc system was is how little Canadians in the South understand about that system and how poorly it's actually been documented. The disc system was imposed at roughly the same time as the Inuit were required to shift to European naming patterns. So required to have a forename and a surname, a given name and a family name. And that caused all kinds of unfortunate, difficult, unpleasant cultural clashes. And that cultural clash led to some moments that I think, when you step back from them, from the outside, are kind of funny. So a group of women, when required to pick names, all chose the same forename and surname, if I'm remembering correctly. So you'd have 3 women all named Annie with the same family name, but they're not actually biologically connected. I found this really funny, but I think the Europeans interacting with the women didn't find it funny, and it lost all sense of the kind of cultural context of how naming patterns go. So my family is Scottish in origin, and there is or used to be, it kind of ended with my generation in many cases, there was a very clear, pretty standard naming pattern of which grandparent you were named after, which male grandparent, which female grandparent, and how it alternated from child to child. But it was all very well understood within the community itself. And it would not be unusual to have 5 Mary McDonalds or 5 Donald McDonald's or Donald McLean's in a single community. And there were, of course, diminutives and nicknames used to distinguish amongst the people. So my favorite of these kinds of nicknames is John Dinky Ross Paddle Wheel McLaughlin. Now that's a fabulous name, and it wouldn't fit on a form. Many people's names don't fit on forms easily. So I found that kind of a moment of kind of, for me, cultural recognition and amusement at how clumsy the European RCMP officers primarily and church officials were in their understanding of how naming works. So the Dunning account of how the disc system came to be and how it functioned and how it fell into disuse is interesting. And it's a very useful account because it's not well documented anywhere. It's a kind of book that I'd recommend that you pick up from the library. It's based on her master's thesis, and while it's smoothly written and the explanations are clear, it is based on a master's thesis, so it has a lot of the kind of repetitive structure that those kinds of works have. They need to have because that's part of their function in an academic setting. I wish she'd had a bit more time to reconsider how to present the information, to rewrite it in a slightly different way. But all that aside, that's a quibble. The content is really quite compelling and quite useful, especially for a European Canadian to read. So borrow it from the library. It's worth the time it'll take you to read it. It's a short little thing. The second book I wanted to highlight from last month's reading is something by Sylvia Townsend Warner. So she's a writer from England in the 1930s and 40s. And she's one of my favorite writers. She's very sly in her writing. And I've read the full titles After the Death of Don Juan, which came out in 1938. This is usually positioned or described as a war about the Spanish Civil War. It's not quite that, I don't think, but nonetheless, it is based on the story of Don Juan or Don Giovanni, and tells the story of Donna Anna's journey after Don Juan has died to take the news of his death to his father. And the journey, she has an entourage with her. It's through a rural landscape and mountainous landscape, and it's not a particularly easy journey. And at the end point of the journey, she meets Don Juan's father, a cast of characters from the village, and there's lots of kind of conflict and difficulty around harvests that aren't going as well as they should. The portraits of all of the characters are typically quite satiric. Nobody comes off very well in the novel. Almost everyone is flawed and limited in certain kinds of ways. The villagers I found the most interesting characters. They're often just sketched in and they perform almost a choral function where they're articulating the ideas and thoughts of a group. So this is a little bit like parts of The Corner That Held Him. That's another one of Warner's novels. I wouldn't recommend starting with Don Juan, After the Death of Don Juan, if you're interested in reading Warner. I don't think it's one of her best novels. If you wanted to read Warner, I would start with Lolly Willows or The Corner That Held Them. It's an odd novel. It ends in a way that is, when you step back, not logical, but it's an abrupt ending, and I'm not sure that it works, but it's an interesting novel. Especially if you're interested in all of Warner's books. If you were interested in a Spanish Civil War novel, I think Muriel Rukeyser's posthumous novel, Savage Coast, which I read earlier this year, I think, or late last year, is more interesting in its more straightforward discussion of the Spanish Civil War. So that's the second one. The third book I want to highlight before I lose the evening light is In the Upper Country by Kai Williams. So this novel came out, this year or last year. It's set in 1850s Upper Canada, so pre-Confederation Canada, around the area just north of Detroit or Windsor. And it's deals with events, it starts at least with events associated with the Fugitive Slave Act, the 1850-ish, where a group of people arrive in a community and they're being pursued by a slave hunter, and there's resistance and multiple bad things happen as a result, as you would expect. It doesn't sugarcoat anything, so it's quite clear on what's happening and why it's happening. And the story unfolds through conversations between, let me get her name correctly, Cinda Martin, who is a journalist essentially, does other things as well, who is based on Marianne Shadd, who did run a newspaper in that area in the middle 1800s. And the conversations between Cinda, who's quite a young woman, and Cash, who's quite an old woman. And over the course of the conversations, their histories are exchanged, like a story for a story, which is kind of a nice structure for this book. And how they're actually connected over time is unfolded. So the stories that Cash and Cinda kind of exchange or relate cover a massive amount of time. It covers history in their families from about the 1760s to 1850, 1860. So there are sections, say, about the War of 1812 and the indigenous population's involvement in those wars. So you see over the course of the novel figures like Joseph Brant and Tecumseh, who are minor characters in the plot and how things unfold. There's conflict between the English and the French, between the British and the Americans, and conflicts between enslaved people and slavers. Williams, it's his first novel, and he's very skilled at keeping, I think, multiple plot lines on the go. So it's the kind of novel where there's a lot of plot unfolding in multiple timelines, and you need to pay attention to what's happening as you're reading. It's not one of those novels that you can gulp down in one big gulp. You need to pay a little bit of attention and be a little bit patient with the fact that you might not always understand who's who in the first 2 or 3 pages of a story that's being told. But on the whole, I think it's quite a strong novel. I read last year or the year before, what is time? Who knows what time is? I read Honoré Jeffers' The Love Songs of W.E. Du Bois, which made the rounds on BookTube in the literary community and was much praised. I didn't actually think it was as strong as many other people thought, but if you were interested in kind of explorations of how other ways of telling African American or African Canadian and Indigenous Canadian histories, I think Williams's novel is a much more interesting novel and in many ways a much more successful novel. Probably a controversial opinion, but I'd highly recommend it. It's not particularly long. It's your standard 350 pages, and it's a satisfying book to read, I think. So that's 3 of the books that I've managed to finish last month, in July, and 3 that I would recommend for different reasons. The Norma Dunning, because it'll educate you a lot about a bit of history that's not well documented, and that's always a useful thing. The Sylvia Warner Townsend is amusing and interesting, but not a perfect novel by any means. And the Kai Williams in the Upper Country, which is a very interesting historical novel. Interesting in its point of view, in the content, and the way that the narrative lines are structured and presented to you. So that's kind of an abbreviated July wrap-up. For August, I've got lots of things on the go, and I'm hoping most of all that the rehab of my ankle makes some steady but sure progress. It's really tiresome not be able to walk everywhere and tear across one place or tear across another place, but have to be very careful with my footing. It'll all work out. I hope you have had a good reading month, that you're having interesting experiences, none of which include tripping and spraining your ankle. Bye-bye.